Good morning, everyone. This morning we're going to try to finish the section in Leviticus on sacrifice. We've got about 3 more sacrifices to go, and then once we've gone through them, I'll say some summary things about all of them in their totality. So remember, thus far we've looked at the burnt offering, which seems to symbolize the necessity for complete dedication to God. And we've looked at the grain offering, in which people are bringing grain from the harvest, and in doing that, they're recognizing that God is the creator and all their sustenance comes from God. So there's a kind of a thanksgiving element to that. So we've got 3 more sacrifices we want to take a look at. This next one, I think, is in many ways the most interesting. At least interesting from the standpoint of its connection to Christianity. And this is what's sometimes called the peace offering, the goodwill offering, or the fellowship offering. I'm going to refer to it as the fellowship offering. We just want to be aware here that sometimes the Hebrew words that are used to designate these sacrifices are open to sort of multiple translations. So I'm going to refer to it as the fellowship offering for reasons that will become clear in just a minute. So we get a description of the fellowship offering in 2 places. The first part is in 3, 1 through 17, and then some more about it is said in 7, 11 through 21. Let's take a look at just the first part for a minute, 3:1. So here we have the description for the peace or fellowship offering. If his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offers an animal from the herd, male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and kill it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall throw the blood against the sides of the altar of burnt offering. And for the sacrifice of the peace offering, as a food offering to the Lord, he shall offer the fat covering the entrails, and all the fat that is on the entrails, and all the fat that is on them at the loins and the long lobe of the liver. And he shall remove the kidneys. Then Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar on top of the burnt offering, which is on the wood on the fire. It is a food offering and a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So here's the description of the first part of the offering. So what happens with this offering is the choicest parts of the animal, which may not strike us as the choicest parts. The liver, the fat, the kidneys, these would have been the choicest parts of the animal back in these days. Obviously, we would probably have a different set of standards about what we thought was choice. But the choicest part of the animal is offered on the altar of burnt offering. Some of the blood is taken and it's dashed against the sides of the altar of burnt offering. And then, and this is where the second part comes in that's really interesting, later on in 7, 11 through 21, we get another element here, and that's this. The part of the animal that's not on the altar of burnt offering is cooked and then eaten in a kind of fellowship dinner somewhere in the precincts of the tabernacle. Hence the term fellowship offering. So let me kind of describe what's going on here. So right, on one hand, you've offered part of the animal as a thanksgiving to God, recognizing that this animal, this creature, is once again a product of creation given to you. And then with the part of the animal that's left over, that's cooked and then combined with bread and then eaten literally as a kind of Thanksgiving dinner, okay? And here's the idea. If you eat something that's been sacrificed or offered to God, the idea here is eating this meal actually now creates a bond between you and God. And it also creates a bond between all those who share in the meal. Now, we've actually seen the peace offering before. You may not remember it, but I pointed out, though that's been a long time ago. I think it was in the first Lincoln administration when we looked at the book of Exodus. But in Exodus 24, at the base of Mount Sinai, as the covenant between God and Israel is being ratified, two kinds of offerings are made. One is a burnt offering, one is a peace or fellowship offering. And then this is what happens. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet as if it were a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. That is, they have a fellowship offering meal literally in the presence of God. Okay, so what's going on here with the fellowship offering now is the fellowship offering kind of brings about a kind of relationship of communion between God and the people who are engaged in the meal. Now, this should sound vaguely familiar. People eating something that's been offered to God. Do you have any memories of doing that? Yeah, it happens every Sunday, doesn't it? We consume something that was offered to God. Okay, so this is the part of the framework here. Actually, it's interesting because Paul actually brings this to our attention in 1 Corinthians 10, 14 to 21. Paul has an interesting discussion of the Eucharist or Holy Communion in the context of the fellowship offering. Let me read part of it to you, and you'll see here. So this is 1 Corinthians 10, 14 and following. Paul's describing and sort of comparing the church's Eucharist and the fellowship offering. So here's what he says. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation? Here, the word that Paul uses here is koinonia, fellowship, from which we get our English word communion, koinonia, communion. In the blood of Christ, the bread that we break, is it not a participation, koinonia, in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. And then this, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar, sharers in the altar? So the idea right here is that Paul's sort of seeing right that in effect the Eucharist and the fellowship offering are sort of analogous to one another. They both bring about a kind of fellowship with God and also a fellowship of those who are sharing the bond. Just a little footnote about that, and we'll see this as time goes on. We just want to remember something here, right? There's a whole lot of ways we can think about our relationships to other people, right? We can think about people who share our interests. We can think about people who went to the same school. We can think about people who live in the same neighborhood or whatever. Here in Israel, the common denominator, the bond that people have, is they all share a common bond to God. That's who they are. That defines their identity. Okay, so in one way, the fellowship offering is actually quite important for Israel and also for her life. Now, the next offering, which begins in 4:1, is sometimes called the sin or purification offering. I'm going to call it purification offering to emphasize something about it. So here's what happens with the purification offering. This offering is for when somebody unintentionally breaks the Torah or breaks the law, breaks God's law. And here I emphasize unintentionally. Okay, the point here is there is no sacrifice which will give you forgiveness if you intentionally break the law. Okay, it's only unintentional. Okay, if you don't know what you're doing, or if you're confused, or you just kind of lapse or something like that. This is cases where we have unintentional violation of the Torah. So I just want to emphasize something here about sin that I think is really important. And one of the reasons why the sin or purification offering can be really helpful for us. The sin offering or the purification offering is reminding us of something that's really important. It's reminding us of how serious sin is. Okay, so there are two dimensions of sin here in the Old Testament that we just want to be aware of, because I think we tend to lose a sense of this. So dimension number one. All sin is a rejection of God's lordship. Okay? That is, I think one of our problems today is we tend to think about sin only in terms of like moral fault. I told a little lie, I didn't do the right thing here, didn't do that there. That's probably somewhat true, but in this context, right? All sin, regardless of what it is, all the way from the little white lie all the way up to murder or something like that, right? All sin here is understood as a rejection of God's lordship. So what we're saying, whenever we sin, right, we're saying, okay, God, I really agree that you're creator, except I'm exempting myself from you in this way. I'm exempting myself from your lordship, I'm going to tell a lie. Or I'm exempting myself from your lordship, and I'm going to spread this gossip. I'm exempting myself from your lordship, on and on. Okay, so really important point here, right? All sin here in the Old Testament is basically where we tell God to take a hike in one way or another. And that's serious business, right? So that's one thing. The other thing about sin is, and this is important too, in the Old Testament, sin not only is a rejection of God's lordship, it also results in our being kind of like polluted or contaminated. So what's going to have to happen, and we'll see this with the purification offering, sin requires not just simply forgiveness, but cleansing. Okay? Here's an image. This may be helpful. And if it's not, just file it away with all the other things I've said, and forget it. So the idea right here is that sin is not only a rejection of God's lordship, but in doing that, right, sin kind of contaminates us. It's as if, in sinning, right, we went out in the backyard and there was like a giant mud puddle and we all just kind of rolled in it for a while. And now we're coming back into the house, right, kind of dripping wet. We're all covered with mud. We don't need mom and dad's forgiveness, although we certainly need that. We need to be hosed down. And that's what's going on here, okay? Sin not only requires or needs forgiveness, it also demands purification. So let's take a look at this as we look at what happens here. So there are a number of things that happen. And here's another aspect of the sin offering. The sin offering will depend, what's offered will depend on who committed the unintentional sin. But the idea here is the sin of one person brings contamination on all of Israel. It's serious depending upon who it is. So if the high priest commits a sin, that's really serious, right? The person that's going into the tabernacle representing you just committed a sin. They need to be purified. Or a leader of the people, right? It's not just that individual sin. Their sin now is coming upon the whole people. Now, lest we think this is just like an Old Testament thing. In 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13, Paul's addressing the issue of sexual immorality in the congregation in Corinth, and he's very clear on the fact, right? There's a couple of folks who are behaving in a very immoral way in Corinth. And Paul says, look, their sin contaminates the whole congregation. Sin is not just an individual, it's not just an individual's business, right? My sin is not just like my little business. Rather, Paul says it brings contamination upon the whole people. So that's why Paul says, well, this is really serious, right? It isn't just a matter of these one or two people getting their acts together. This is a problem like for the whole congregation. So this idea continues all the way into the New Testament. So here's what happens with the sin offering. Here's a couple things would happen with the sin offering. So first, you, depending upon who sinned, you bring the appropriate offering to the entrance to the tabernacle. The person who's committed the sin lays their hand on it, and the idea seems to be, right, I'm identifying with the animal. Okay, and maybe even more, right? My contamination, my pollution now is being conveyed from me to the animal. And then I kill the animal at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So notice the point there, right? Guess what the consequence of sin ultimately is? Death. Right? If you turn away from the Creator, who's the source of life, right? And if you're a creature, that's not a really wonderful scenario. Okay, that's like unplugging an appliance and still expecting it to work. Okay, this is not going to happen. So, right, in effect, right, what we have with the sin offering is a sort of dramatic and very vivid expression of just how serious sin is, right? Sin is the turning away from God, and it eventually will result in our death, our destruction. Then, the other thing that happens here that's also kind of interesting is some of the blood from that sacrifice now that's been offered is put in a kind of a basin. The sons of Aaron then take some of that blood, and they dash it against the tent, the sort of the entrance of the tabernacle. And so the idea here is that the blood from the sacrificed animal is making atonement for the person who committed the sin. That is, the idea here is that the sin has been now, and its contamination have been relocated. They are now located on the animal who is then killed, and the animal has made atonement for the person who sinned. So it's also interesting to notice the three reasons why the sin offering, purification offering needs to be offered. Notice what they are. The refusal to testify in court. If you know something that's relevant to the case, but you just don't want to say anything. That requires atonement. Touching something unclean, and we'll take a look at uncleanness later on, because there's a long discussion of it here in Leviticus. Or making a rash oath, a rash promise that you really have no intention of keeping. Yeah, Pam? They can be unintentional. Yeah. And once again, it's sometimes difficult to see how this category of sacrifice is distinguished from the next one, because there's a lot of similarity between them, and so things get a little fuzzy. And that's probably due to the sources that we have. So notice here, just as sort of a general comment, unintentional sin here comes essentially from a lack of reverence for God's law. That is, I think the general takeaway here from all this is that unintentional sins will in effect result from a lack of reverence for God's law. So the idea here is we're getting a dramatization of the seriousness of sin, and that sin isn't just sort of like an inner private feeling. It's a reality that has to be dealt with. Now, the next category of offering is sometimes called the reparation or guilt offering. And it's difficult to see how this sacrifice is distinguishable from the one we just talked about. It may be we just don't know enough, or it may be that we're asking for more distinction that is possible. But anyway, in this category of sacrifice, which we find in 5:14 and following, we're talking about, once again, unintentional sins, which kind of fall into one of a couple categories. The unintentional misuse of something devoted to God, unintentional disobedience to God's commandments, or an unintentional breach of faith with another person. You made a promise and you unintentionally didn't keep it for some reason or another. Now, I think kind of a general observation here is this. That is, notice what's going on here. Notice that the bond which holds the people of Israel together is a sacred bond. And therefore, we have something here that I want to emphasize because I think we tend to forget about it here, right? Notice here that in the Old Testament and the New Testament is the same thing. The Old Testament and the New Testament don't really make a distinction between what we now call theology and ethics. That's in many ways a modern distinction, okay? So, right, we can, in modern Christianity, we make a distinction between like someone who holds a heretical view and someone who engages in immorality. Neither the Old Testament nor the New Testament make such a distinction. The two are the same thing. Okay, so it's really important to notice those things are held together. Now, what's going on here? Well, first of all, the idea right here is that the bond between the people of Israel is a sacred bond. It's a bond that involves God. And therefore, you can't easily distinguish harming someone else and sinning against God. Right? That's why when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, right, and the person asking clearly is hoping for a minimalist answer. Right? You know, what's the greatest commandment? You know, make it easy, Jesus. That's why Jesus, well, that's easy, right? The greatest commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Oh, and by the way, the second, which you didn't ask for, is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Those two categories are indistinguishable. Okay, so we're seeing this here in Leviticus. Another aspect of the reparation offering or the guilt offering, as opposed to the sin or cleansing offering, is in this case the offering serves as, and the ESV uses the word compensation. That is, when you're making your offering, right, you're offering something, and what you're doing is you're compensating God for what you did. Obviously, this is somewhat of an anthropomorphic thought, but I think we can see its value, right? All sin is finally sin against God. You've injured God. And now you need to sort of do something to sort of make up for the injury. Okay? It's not just, oh, you know, I feel really bad about what I did and I'm going to go home and I'll do the same thing tomorrow. No, it's like, no, this is really serious. You sinned against God, so you need to sort of do something that helps you understand how serious this is. Okay? So that's one of the things that's going on here. Now, let me say just a few comments about all the sacrifices kind of taken together, and that's where we'll conclude. One of the things that's true with all the sacrifices here is this. They remind us of two really important things that we don't want to forget and that will be important later on when we get to the New Testament. First of all, right, the sacrifices here in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus remind us that we always have to keep two things in our minds in balance. On one hand, the awareness of sin and its severity. Okay, thing number one, the awareness of sin and its severity. And then secondly, that needs to have come immediately with it, the graciousness of God who offers both forgiveness and cleansing. Those two things have to be kept together, because when they're pulled apart, one of the thing that's left will inevitably wither away. Okay, so notice what happens, right? If you end up with a pretty trivial understanding of sin, guess what happens? You end up with a trivial understanding of forgiveness, right? If sin is simply, we all occasionally mess up, and hey, we've all been there, and God's willing to forgive us, kind of pat us on the back and tell us we're good boys and girls and send us along our way, right? That means the whole process has now been trivialized. Okay, so the idea here is that we have to keep these two things in mind. Sin is literally lethal, but forgiveness and cleansing are real. Sin is lethal, but forgiveness and cleansing are from God, and therefore they are very real, and therefore both have to be kind of held together. So that's one thing. The other thing that's important here is that each one of these sacrifices is sort of dramatizing and reminding us of something that happens, something that needs to happen in terms of our relationship with God. The burnt offering is reminding us of our need, right, to offer ourselves wholeheartedly to God. The grain offering is reminding us of the fact, right, that we need to see everything we have as the gift of God. The sin or purification offering is reminding us of our constant need for purification. The guilt offering is reminding us of just how serious sin is, and the fact that we have sort of hurt or injured, quote unquote, the honor and majesty of God. So all these offerings, right, are a way of sort of helping us to be aware of what needs to happen for human beings to be sort of turned back toward God. A second thing that's going on here, and I won't dwell on this in detail now because there'll be later time to sort of think about it. Each of these sacrifices also has a way of illuminating and saying something about Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Okay, just as one example, right? Certainly one of the consequences of Jesus' sacrifice is a restoration of koinonia or communion between us and God. Okay, that would be one example, right? So all the sacrifices that we just looked at actually also shed light on Jesus' sacrifice on the cross in one way or another. One final thing, one kind of final comment here, and this will get us up to Leviticus 8, and here we'll see the ordination of Aaron and priesthood. We'll take a look at that next Sunday. The sacrifices also, I think, are helping us to be mindful of something that's really important. Later on, in the latter part of chapter 6, we get some more instructions about the offerings. And it looks like Leviticus was actually sort of meant in part to be sort of like a handbook for Aaron and his sons, kind of instruction manual. But one of the things we learn is that the burnt offering is to be offered once in the morning and once in the evening every day, as a reminder. Okay? Burnt offering symbolizing and acting total dedication to God, right? First thing in the morning, last thing during the day. Again and again and again and again. Important reminder. Another little detail, and one of the things we'll discover is that there's no unimportant detail in Leviticus. Okay, we don't have time to talk about all the details, but they're all important. So another important detail in Leviticus is that there's this altar of burnt offering, and I think I mentioned it a while back, but it's not to be funny or anything, but the altar of burnt offering is essentially sort of like a giant barbecue pit. It's a big kind of box overlaid with gold with a grill, and there's a fire in the box. The fire on the altar of burnt offering is to be kept burning continually. never to go out. And the idea here seems to be that the fire on the altar of burnt offering is, in effect, right, a kind of living symbol of the holiness of God. It borrows, right, on the kind of the twofold meaning of fire, right? Fire simultaneously refines but also destroys, right? Fire consumes that which is not good, but it refines that which is good. And in that sense, fire is a great living symbol of God's holiness. Later on in the letter to the Hebrews, in Hebrews 12, right, this will reappear because the author will remind his readers, right, that we should offer to God sacrifices with fear and trembling, because why? Our God is a consuming fire, a God who purifies, okay, who burns away sin and who cleanses and who purifies us. So two important details here in Israel's sacrifice. One final thing, and then I'll stop because we're kind of running out of time. But just once again, we want to be mindful of the context here. This will become clear later on as we read through the book of Leviticus. But remember, all this is taking place in front of the tabernacle, which is God's dwelling place. It's a really important thing here, right? All the things we're reading about, sacrifices, law, the whole 9 yards, right, actually is given to Israel for one reason, and one reason only. The people of Israel literally are dwelling in the presence of God. Not figuratively, not metaphorically, but God is literally dwelling in their presence in that tabernacle. And that totally changes and reorients who they are and how they're supposed to live. And Leviticus will sort of give us a description of what that kind of reorienting of life is all about. We'll pick things up next week at Leviticus 8, where we'll see the ordination of Aaron and his sons to the priesthood of the Old Covenant.